Delighted to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kirsty Mchugh and I'm Chief Executive of the Employment Related Services Association, a bit of a mouthful, IRSA, and we are the membership body for organisations here in the UK who provide support to people who are unemployed. Primarily the long-term unemployed, but actually the unemployed more generally. So our members are corporates, they're charities, they're housing associations, they're local authorities, and they're all working in that particular employment support space. Now, my members have a lot to learn in the nicest possible way. Okay? A lot to learn for the Behavioural Insights approach. Indeed, we had the Behavioural Insights team coming along and speaking at our AGM earlier this year. And a huge amount of interest, but also a case of, well, aren't we doing this anyway? Well, if you are, you're not doing it in any sort of systematic way. And so, that's why I'm here. It's why I'm really pleased to be supporting this conference. Now, as you've heard, the focus today is on that job search grind. Now, put up your hand if you have done job search grind at some point in your life. It's not good, is it? It's really no fun at all. And if you are unemployed, long-term unemployed in particular, we know the negative consequences of that, the downward spiral, can be really very severe, both in terms of people's mental health, but also, of course, in terms of the costs to the country. Any country, and that's not just in terms of lost tax receipts and sort of benefit payments, etc. It's about the use of an awful lot of public services there as well. Now, here in the UK, we've been in the fortunate situation of an economy which actually has been strengthening, and our labour market has been strengthening as well. Unemployment has been going down. That said, the last couple of months of labour market statistics, we've seen short-term unemployment going up. Maybe a blip, maybe not a blip, we don't know yet. But long-term unemployment has been going down. I'd like to think because of my members, probably a few other factors there as well. But we know that there's a very stubborn cohort of job seekers out there where very little is touching. We've got far more information about the profile of those job seekers and the length of time they've been out of the labour market. And that's where a lot of the government focus is at this point in time. So, we're going to have 4 esteemed speakers this afternoon, some of which are currently writing their speeches. No, they're all come prepared. And they're going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes each. And they've already been warned. They're going to keep to time. I'm going to be very strict in relation to these things. So, first of all, we are going to hear from Ragnhild, pronounced that right, from the University of Oslo, who's currently with University College London. Then from Philipp Kircher, Professor of Economics at Edinburgh University. Then from Florian, University of Zurich, and then Darren, Head of Research at Escher House, and worked in Australia, UK, USA, etc. These 4 know an awful lot about this, so get your notebooks out. All right. Without further ado then, I'm going to ask Ragnhild to take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to speak at this conference. So I'm going to present a research project that is about a relatively modest policy intervention that was aimed at inducing long-term sick-listed workers to return to work. So it's not about unemployed workers, but sick-listed workers. But I think we might learn something that can be relevant also for unemployed workers. So I borrowed a graph from the OECD that I think motivates quite well this research we have done. So the graph shows the sick leave rate in a number of OECD countries in 2010. And the average is around 2.5%. Even though the graph is a bit blurry, I think you are all able to see the outlier to the far left. That is Norway with so on any given workday in 2010, around 7% of Norwegian workers were absent. This might be related to the fact that we have a very generous system of sick leave payments. So workers are entitled to a full wage for an entire year and with full employment protection. And this might lead to some moral hazard problems, meaning that workers behave differently. They take up more absence when they are insured against the cost than they would have done in the case that they hadn't been insured. So it's quite a puzzle how to curb this absenteeism without cutting benefits. So in this research project I'm going to talk about, we ask if the solution can be as simple as having a dialogue. To speed up the return to work process for absent workers, a dialogue meeting was introduced in Norway in 2007. And a couple of words about these dialogue meetings. They are arranged by the local social security administration offices around 6 months into absence spells. And the purpose of these meetings are to bring together the absentee, the employer, and often also the certifier of the sick leave, which is often the personal physician of the absentee. And at this meeting, they discuss whether some arrangements can be made to induce full or partial work resumption. I'm not going to talk anymore about the details of what happens at these meetings, because it turns out that it's not necessarily only attending this meeting and what happens at this meeting that is important. So the local social security offices are imposed by law to arrange these meetings, but it turns out that exemptions are quite common. However, exemptions are not random, so to evaluate effects of the meeting, we cannot simply compare workers who are called to the meeting with workers who are not called to the meeting. Instead, we exploit that there is substantial variation in the use of exemption practices between local social security administration offices. So there is a geographical variation in use of exemptions. And there is also variation in the timing of these meetings into absence spells. So some workers are called to the meetings after 4 months, some after 6, some after 8. And this strategy actually allows us not only to estimate an effect of attending these dialogue meetings, but also a separate effect of being called to the meeting. So this is what we call the notification effect. So if you look at the timeline, after around 6 months, most workers are called to a dialogue meeting. And then we estimate a notification effect, the effect of this call. This turns out to induce some workers to return to work even before the meeting takes place. So we are left with a selected group of workers who will actually attend the dialogue meeting. And we then estimate an attendance effect, which is the effect of recently having attended a meeting. So what do we find? These meetings have a quite substantial effect on the sick leave rate. Each such dialogue meeting reduces the duration until partial or full work resumption by around 20 days. And if we look at the duration until only full work resumption, the corresponding number is 10 days. And the maybe stunning thing is that the notification effect actually accounts for half of this effect. So simply receiving this call to the meeting accounts for half of this effect. I will come back to this on the last slide, but first we further estimate some long-term effects, and we find some positive effects of earnings and employment prospects a couple of years after the absentee attended the meeting. We also find reduced disability dependency a couple of years later. Finally, we conduct a simple cost-benefit analysis and find that this is a highly cost-efficient policy measure. With a conservative estimate of the benefits still gives twice as high benefits as costs. So I will spend the last couple of minutes talking about the mechanisms. So this meeting was introduced as a way for the caseworker at the local social security office to monitor the work resumption efforts of the absentee, the employer, and also to some extent the physician. Unfortunately, we are not able to shed light on the relative importance of these three parties. So it might be that it's the absentee who, when receiving this call to the letter, they realized that in 3 weeks they have to attend a meeting where they have to demonstrate their actual need for absence to not only the caseworker, but also their employer and their personal physician. And the thought of having to go to this meeting might actually induce them to go back to work before the meeting takes place. But it might also be the employer who reacts to receiving a call to this meeting, or the physician, because since it is the physicians who certify the sick leave, they act as sort of gatekeepers for the benefit system, and they, when receiving a call to the meeting, maybe they feel a need to demonstrate that they actually manage this role as a gatekeeper of the benefit system. So, but if the mechanism is mainly through the absentee, this can be explained by hyperbolic discounting, meaning that so activities for which some future benefits must be weighed against the current cost tend to be postponed, even though the activity in itself is optimal in the long term. So hyperbolic absentees or employers will tend to postpone this uncomfortable work resumption effort yet another couple of days. And our finding may show that in these situations, a small nudge might be sufficient to speed up the work resumption process. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me and to allow me to present on a study together with Michel Belot and Paul Müller on how to provide advice to job seekers at very low costs. I'm a professor of economics. Just imagine I lose my job and I don't find a new one. Right? So our toolkit by which you can help me to find a job basically includes 3 big things that you can do. Right? Either you can retrain me. Right? You can train me as a computer programmer and I might find a job this way. Right? Now that turns out to be usually quite costly, right? But it's fairly well evaluated by now. There are lots of studies on that. The other thing that you can think is maybe I'm just slacking off. I'm really not searching hard enough, right? So what you can do is you can monitor me, you can sanction me if I don't perform, or you can cut my unemployment benefits. All of these things might actually induce me to search harder, find a job quicker. Now that's quite invasive, but still, we've done it a lot and we understand some things about this. Right? The last thing that might happen is you might understand that I'm actually genuine. I really want a job, but I just don't quite know how to get one. Right? Now, what you might want to do is you might want to give me advice. Right? This is the last big pillar of active labor market policy, and it's unfortunate that this is a lot less studied than the other 3. And it's kind of clear why, right? You have to train advisors, they're gonna do a whole bunch of things. It's hard to say which one of them actually works, which one's not. It's hard to replicate, but there seems to be a lot of promise there, right? So that's where we want to come in. And our approach is to basically recognize that a lot of search today is done over the internet, right? Now, the internet has many advantages, right? For once, you can replicate, right? Whatever I do as advice on the internet, you can replicate it further on. It's very cheap to do, right? Once it's set up, I can basically do it at essentially 0 marginal cost to other people, right? So it's a bit similar to a nudge, right? It's very cheap. I can do it for lots of people. I don't force people to do things. It does contain real information, though. My hunch is that the reason why there's an indication that it might work is because we make it easy for people. It's not just putting out information, but also make it easy for people to access. And I think that's where the key of these things is. Right? What type of advice do we provide? We provide advice on a very specific thing on occupations, right? I'm a professor of economics. I don't find a professor job anymore. I might simply not know what else I should be doing, right? Can we help by telling people what they might actually consider? That's where we want to go, right? How do we do it? We basically create our own job centers, right? We invited 300 unemployed people in Edinburgh to come to our computer lab, right? They come for weekly sessions for 12 weeks or until they find a job, right? They stay for at least 30 minutes and look for jobs. They can stay longer, they can search from home, right? But this is a minimum that they do. Now, how do we make it into a representative environment? We might get away with few people, right? But they have to search for something that's real. And the Department of Work and Pensions was very nice to basically give us all their vacancy database. So we cover about 90% of the vacancies in the UK, right? Which is was a big step in getting this off the ground. We monitor what people do in the lab with us, and we ask them what else they do. They must ask friends and relatives, they get job offers elsewhere. We try to keep track on what they do, right? For the first 3 weeks, everybody does the same thing. After 3 weeks, half of them get switched to our recommendation platform where we try to help them through recommendations. Now, if I had more time, I think this study has many advantages, but obviously we have a small number of participants. For a lab study, it's a lot, but I would love to roll this out bigger, and if anybody wants to work with me on this, I would be very happy. So this is what we do. 3 weeks, everybody does the same thing. I'll show you on the next slide what the same thing is. After 3 weeks, half of them simply continue, half of them get something new. And we evaluate how much is a new thing helping this second group relative to what the first group does. So it's a different design. Now, hard to read maybe, but this is basically what everybody does. This is our normal interface. This is what you would expect to be doing, right? You can put in keywords. You have to yourself come up with keywords. I might put in here professor of economics, right? Then you can put in occupations here, a location and a radius. You click search, and I give you things back that fit to the criteria that you put in, okay? That's what people use for 3 weeks, and half of them use for the entire time. Now, what's the alternative? The alternative, we ask you as a participant, what is it that you are looking for? I might say, look, I want to be a professor in economics, but in this case, right, this person answered that she wants to be a waitress, probably because she had been a waitress before. That's what she knows, right? What do? Right? We go back to representative household surveys, right? We go back to the British Household Panel Survey. We look at people that are already waitresses, and we look at what else they do in their lives. That's the top list here, right? Most of them stay waiters, right? But some of them become sale and retail assistants, bar staff, cooks, and retail cashiers, right? That's list number 1. List number 2 is we went to a US website that did an incredible job by looking at what other occupations use similar skills than the one you're looking for, right? And that's this list here. There's some overlap, but they have other things like stock clerks and order filers, cashiers, and so on, right? Now we tell people how we construct this. There's no mystery, no rabbits coming out some kind of hat or something, right? We tell people that this is the way we construct it, right? Now the process basically but needs 2 clicks, right? First, you put in your occupation, you click once, you get to see all of this. Unless you play around with this further by deselecting, you do 1 more click, and you don't only get the waiter and waitress jobs, but any job that fits to any of the criteria that we put on here, right? So what I want you to take away from is it's a way to get people to think hopefully about new stuff, and it's easy. You don't have to figure out yourself how to look into the British Household Panel Survey. You don't have to understand anything much. You simply play around with it, and hopefully you learn, and hopefully it helps, right? Now, a sample, as you would expect from a randomized controlled trial, right? It's balanced in terms of previous characteristics, in terms of job search, in terms of what they do in the first 3 weeks, so that's all very encouraging. Now, one thing you might worry about to analyze something like this is attrition, right? You start with the same sample, but people find jobs differentially over time. That's what we would like. Unfortunately, we're in a recession. People don't find a lot of jobs. Tough for us. Makes it hard to evaluate this type of thing. We don't find much of a difference between the 2 in job finding. Makes it easy to analyze other things because the samples don't change very much over time. But ideally, I would have much more data and would see whether people really find more jobs through it, right? At the moment, right, with the job finding rates that we have, it's not much to be said. What's the next best thing? Where can I actually say something with the limited data that I have? The next thing is number of interviews. People tend to get a lot more interviews than they get jobs, and there's much more scope to detect something. That's the next best thing I can report on. Interviews inside the lab and outside the lab. Now, this is not the only thing that we care about, is also how did you get there? The nice thing is we know what you actually do. So we can look at what we expose you to. These are the things that you see on your screen. Are you becoming broader in terms of the diversity of occupational codes that you are looking at? Are you becoming different in terms of whether you search outside or inside Edinburgh, right? Do you simply see more things, right? And the next thing is, what do you do? Do you apply to a higher variety of things? Do you apply further out of Edinburgh, or do you actually simply do more? Right? These are the measures that we can look at. And I'll go from the top. I first see, did we actually expose them to different stuff relative to the control group? Next thing, do they do something differently, and is it helping them? Well, that will be 3 minutes to get through that, right? So first thing is, do we do something different with the group that's exposed? And the answer is yes, right? In terms of the variety of occupations they look at a lot broader variety, right? Now, They don't look at a lot more overall. They don't look at the geographically very different codes, but we seem to be doing something. Now that marks some heterogeneity. It's kind of obvious, right? Some people, without us doing anything, they look at very narrow things, right? These are the professors of economics that have no clue, right? Other people look very broadly. They look at each and every job in Edinburgh. Not very surprising, we have very different effects. So we split the sample in half by the median, right? The narrow people, and we compare them with narrow people in the control group, the broad people, and compare them with broad people. And lo and behold, the narrow people is where all the action is. Those are the guys that we make broader. They actually contract a bit in geography, probably because they see more things locally. They don't have to search so far away. They don't actually look very, very much more, but they look at more diverse stuff. People that are already broad, we actually narrow them down, right? And that might potentially hurt them. So there's something to worry about, okay? Next thing, do they do different things? Well, not so much on average. In terms of when we've split it apart, these guys that are narrow, they still become broader, even though non-significantly so. They still cut back in geography, and they do a lot more action. They actually apply a lot more than they did before, right? The other guys might have a little bit of a cutback. These are odds ratios, so this is a 31% improvement. They go a bit down, right? Now, so the group we wanted to affect, we seem to be doing something. Now, do we actually help, right? Now, this is the odds ratio, right? So this is basically a 29% improvement in the total number of interviews that these people get, right? Now, I think this is encouraging. It's a small study, but it shows at the right direction. And it all comes from the people that are narrow, right? They are helped both in the lab, but it also seems to be spilling over on what they do outside the lab, in contrast to what you might have expected. They might do more with us, and therefore they cut back on what they do outside the lab. That's not what's going on, okay? Finally, Kirsty might be interested. It all comes from the people that are a bit longer unemployed, okay? A bit longer unemployed people, they really react to us. I have a story for this if I had more time. Okay, so the story is basically, right, I lose my job as economics professor or as a waiter. The first thing is I look for the same thing that I've been doing before. You tell me, why don't you become a computer programmer? Say, well, I want to be a professor, right? 3 months later, right? I'm not looking so great with my professor ambitions, right? So maybe I'm more open to your advice, right? And we can write a formal model of all of this. Now, basically, what do we try to tell as the findings here, right? Information seems to be leading to more interviews, right? They have effects on these people that are kind of hard, the longer-term unemployed that are harder to place, right? These guys that are searching narrow that seem to be running out of ideas. We present it in a very easy way. I think that's why it works. It's not only information, but also the ease at which we present it to them, right? But I think much more is needed, right? We need a larger study to really see, does it translate really into more jobs? Do these more interviews really help them? Do they actually keep their jobs? Not only about finding, but also keeping them, and are the wages adequate relative to what they could have gotten in the control group? For that, one needs administrative data. I would love to work with the Department of Work and Pensions. Hopefully, if somebody's here, that can be done. We need to worry about general equilibrium effects, right? One needs to worry about the fact we tell some people to search in other occupations than they have done before. That might help them, but it might hurt people that are already looking there, right? You need a good design to figure out that we don't hurt other people, and obviously there's much more to be learned. How it's not only about information, but how it's presented, how easy we make it to them. And that would be it. Lovely. Thank you very much.
All right, so thanks a lot for the invitation. It's great fun to be here. So what I'm presenting is joint work with Steffen Altmann, Armin Falk, and Simon Jäger, and I think it nicely complements what Philipp just told us. And the starting point for the project is the very simple observation that job search is hard. It's just very hard. If you're unemployed and you're looking for a job, there's many challenges waiting for you. Two of the key challenges, in our opinion, are, first of all, information. You simply need to know a lot of things to be able to look effectively for a job. And the other is motivation. It's just difficult to keep motivated during the process of job search, sending out hundreds of applications, getting rejected again and again. And so our idea, or the idea of this project, is really to develop a relatively simple and easy to implement intervention with the goal to help job seekers master these challenges. So I think the general topic doesn't need that much motivation. Unemployment is a huge problem in most societies. Therefore, getting job seekers into employment once they're unemployed is sort of one of the first order policy challenges. It's a clear task and mandate of unemployment agencies. And this was already mentioned before. A key task that policymakers have really worried about over the last decades is how to get long-term unemployed back into employment. And the key reason for that is that long-term unemployed is particularly detrimental, mainly because it very much deteriorates human capital, up to the point that after a very long unemployment spell, long-term unemployed really, they basically become unemployable. Okay, so in order to prevent that, what we need to do is we need to get the people that are at risk of becoming long-term unemployed, and we need to try to get them faster back into employment. And so kind of the overall research question that summarizes, or policy question that summarizes all of this is, how can we improve job search processes in order to help people get back into employment faster? And our starting point, like I already said, is the simple observation that job search is hard and that job search is challenging. And there's a very nice quote by Linda Babcock and co-authors that very nicely summarizes this. What they argue is that looking for work is in the first place a substantial information problem. Workers have to understand labor market conditions, have knowledge of openings and applications processes, and determine the quality of matches with employers. More important, or moreover, searching for work requires willpower, which can be costly for individuals to draw upon. So there you can already see these two components, information and motivation, that sort of guide our study. So let's be a bit more specific about what these challenges are. First of all, information. What is it that job seekers really need to know? And actually, it's a lot. The first question you need to ask yourself when you're unemployed is, does my search effort pay off? What are really the returns to my search effort? And for that, it's crucial to think about what are the benefits of employment. And there, intuitively, the monetary benefits are very obvious to job seekers, right? However, the non-monetary, the non-pecuniary benefits, such as health benefits, benefits in terms of your social relationships, these are less salient to people. And if that's the case, then overall, people seem to or tend to underestimate the value of having a job, and that, of course, then decreases their search effort. Similarly, what's the likelihood of finding a job, and how does this likelihood depend on my search effort? And there it seems that many unemployed tend to underestimate their marginal returns to search effort, and that, of course, then also decreases their level of search effort. Another question is, which channels should I use for my applications? Which are the most effective channels? How broadly should I search? This is what Philipp just talked about. And also, in terms of motivation, I think this is even more intuitive. The cycle of applications and getting rejected over and over again intuitively causes a lot of frustration and makes it very difficult for job seekers to maintain a high level of motivation and a high level of search effort. All right, so job search is challenging. This causes low level of search intensity as well as ineffective search. And so the question is, can we help job seekers master these challenges? So to be a bit more specific, what we ask is, can a simple brochure that aims at informing and motivating job seekers, can such a brochure help them sort of master these challenges and be more successful in terms of labor market outcomes? So the simple thing we did is we tried to create a brochure, and now I'm going to tell you how this looks like. So that's the brochure. It's in Germany because the study was conducted in Germany. It's sort of on an A4 letter format. On the cover letter it says unemployed, what now? And then when you open the brochure, you get all these kinds of information. So let me walk you through the information we provided. And let me actually skip the first part. The first part is simply an introductory part where we provide them with basic information about the current labor market situation, and it's framed in a nice way. The second part is more interesting. The first component there is that we emphasize the importance of active search, and we inform job seekers about the fact that many unemployed actually underestimate the marginal returns to search effort. Of course, we describe it in very basic and intuitive terms. And we emphasize that they really should, that search effort pays off and that they should search hard. The second component is we describe in very intuitive terms the phenomenon of duration dependence, meaning that the longer your unemployment spell is, the less attractive you become for employers. And we emphasize that to avoid this duration dependence trap, it makes sense to start early with your search and to search hard early on. The second component informs people about the non-pecuniary benefits of employment, emphasizing that having a job really pays off, not only in monetary terms, but in terms of health, in terms of life satisfaction, and so on. And then the final part emphasizes the importance of relying on different search channels. In particular, we emphasize the importance of relying on online search because this has been shown to be quite effective. We make a couple of examples on the last page of the brochure where we make suggestions of online platforms where they can actually search. And then the very last paragraph is sort of again, more on the motivation side. There we simply tell people that if they are discouraged during this during the job search process, they should sort of try to keep up the spirit, because this is what happens to everyone, and they should sort of simply continue, and at some point it hopefully will pay off. So that's how the brochure looks like. And now, of course, we want to know, does it actually help? Does it actually help job seekers? So what we do is we evaluate the brochure in cooperation with the EAB, which is the research institute of the German Unemployment Agency. We conduct a field experiment with job seekers in Germany. We have 160,000 job seekers, which are randomly assigned to the treatment condition, meaning that they receive this brochure, and then, of course, the control condition simply doesn't receive anything. They receive this brochure via regular mail, and that design, because we also have access to the official register data, then allows us to evaluate the causal impact of individuals' labor market outcomes, employment, as well as earnings. More specifically, what we can also do with our data, we can also evaluate the causal impact for job seekers that are of risk at long-term unemployment, because, as I already said, this is really one of the groups that we care about most. So what do we find? We have a lot of outcome measures that we can and do look at in the paper. Here I'm going to focus on two that very nicely summarize the results of our intervention. The first is, very simply, days of employment since the treatment. So we can follow job seekers up to 1 year after the treatment, and what we simply do here is we count the number of days they were employed, and then we compare if the number of days of employment for the subjects that received the brochure is higher than for those who didn't receive the brochure. And what you can see here is that, of course, in the beginning, there's really no treatment effect, but then slowly over time, it picks up. And then in the end, so the way to interpret this number here is that after 1 year, people that received the brochure on average have worked 1 day more. That sounds like a very small effect. On the other hand, keep in mind that, first of all, the brochure is a very subtle thing. It's extremely cheap. So let's look at another measure that nicely summarizes the effect of the brochure, which is cumulative earnings from the labor market since the treatment. Okay, so similar to number of days employed, we now sort of count their earnings for 1 year after the treatment intervention. What you can see here is 1 year after the treatment intervention, again on average, subjects who received the brochure earned about 150 euros more. Compare that with the cost of the brochure of about 50 cents. It's kind of a good, it's a good ratio. So summarizing this, the brochure seems to have small overall effects on employment and earnings. However, it must be said that although the point estimates are positive, when we look at them in the raw data, they're not statistically significant. If we look at other specifications and control for certain things, they become significant. But overall, I think it's fair to say that these results need to be looked at with great caution, and overall, these effects are not significant. So now look at the group that we might care most about, job seekers at risk of becoming long-term unemployed. If we look at this group, we see that now the effects are much more pronounced, actually similar than what we've seen in Philipp's studies. If we look at 1 year after the treatment intervention, so after subjects in the treatment group received the brochure, these guys work for almost 5 days more compared to the control condition. If we look at cumulative earnings, 1 year after receiving the brochure, they earned about a bit more than 400 euros more than the control group. Okay? So if we summarize, the information brochure has positive, but again, relatively small and in general insignificant effects in the overall sample. However, for the group of job seekers that is at risk of becoming long-term unemployed, we have much more substantial effects. Within 1 year, treated individuals work about 5 days more. They earn about 450 euros more, corresponding to about 4% increase in employment as well as earnings. The cost-benefit ratio for this is very nice. Like I mentioned already, the costs of the brochure are very, very low, so the cost-benefit ratio is really, really good. And sort of our conclusion is that these findings suggest that information provision can in fact help improve labor market prospects, in particular of individuals that are really at risk of becoming long-term unemployed. All right, thank you.
Lovely, thank you so much.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is the implementation of what we call the Applied Behavioural Science for Employment Services model, or ABS, which was actually, I stuck with that because it's a subliminal message for me that if I'm delivering an ABS program, I'd lose a bit of weight, but it hasn't worked, unfortunately. There are some key facts with this. We've implemented it now with about 70,000 job seekers. By the end of this year, it will be 100,000. It started about 5 years ago with 100 people. It worked well, so we built it up to 1,000, then 10,000, and then we got the funding indirectly through the Department of Employment in Australia, through something they've got called the Employment Pathways Fund, which they give to employment service providers who then try and innovate and buy in services such as ours. Bruce is here from the Department of Employment, so if you see me kissing him later at Skylab, that's why. He's indirectly funded all of this. The model has three key parts. First of all, we do an assessment, as with most new programs. But this assessment is a stage of change. It's to ascertain somebody's genuine commitment or desire to getting a job. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Then some of those people, depending on their stage or commitment to getting a job, go through the ABS, Applied Behavioural Science workshops. There are 5 half-day workshops created from 31 evidenced interventions. Half of the last 7 years of effort with this program has been to contextualize those interventions that might work with school children. They might work with 1.1 million US Army soldiers. Contextualizing them towards our clients, the unemployed customers, has been difficult because they can just go, I'm out of here in these workshops, whereas the military and school children generally do what they're told. So that's been a fascinating process. And then we inform or advise coaches or support the employment advisors with one-to-one guidance, coaching guides, just a little one-pager on what you should do with that individual sat in front of you. But we'll explain that in a little more in a moment. We've done this across Australia and the West Coast USA, Oregon and California, and now we've just launched in the UK and as of today in Denmark, in Odense commune. Engagement is up. People are turning up to these workshops and they're turning up more to the one-to-ones. There has been some papers or press recently seeing behavioural insights implemented with your target audience as being coercion. We're trying to change the personalities of people to try and be good citizens, where the only good citizen is a citizen that wants to work. But actually, we're trying to maximise the good things about those individuals so that they can realise their own potential, rather than shoehorning them into what the government might want them to be as an ideal citizen. So it's a very subtle difference, but it's an annoying point that's been made in these papers, but it's actually a really pertinent point as well. And luckily, world-leading increases in outcomes, which I'll explain a bit more. The worst performing project has delivered a 10.38 return on investment. So for every dollar you spend, you get 10.38 back, which is good. And that's an unusual way of terming these things, because we're doing it from an academic point of view, but the most important thing for ministers often, or employment service providers, is if I'm spending money on this program, is it worth it? Am I going to make money back? Am I saving money? Or the underlying theme, particularly of tomorrow of this conference, am I getting more for less? So it's a key point. My business, Esher House, and my university that I'm attached to, ACU in Sydney, has had a habit of debunking conventional wisdom. We've addressed why there's such high burnout in the industry. I won't go into any of these, but it's to do with macaque monkeys and mirror neurons. So if you get me tiddly later, I'll go into that. But it's fascinating. It's all to do with empathy, mirror neurons, empathy, the greatest strength when we ask advisors, why are you such good advisors? Empathy, but that's also can be the greatest weakness. We've addressed and undertaken research papers with a generational unemployed, in-group, out-group, finding out that actually if you do get a long-term unemployed person from a long-term unemployed family where everybody's unemployed, if you work on those and try and get them a job, they don't behave as some government departments might, as logically we might expect. The rest of the family don't look at them as a shining example and try and emulate them. They actually ostracize them. They take the mickey out of them. They undermine them. We've worked with youth who, it appears, even though they've been unemployed 3 times less time than the over 55s, their optimism about finding a job is much lower. Is their resilience lower? When they're 55, will they be more resilient? It's an interesting question. We've worked with disabled unemployed and looked at the impact of policy of reassessment, perhaps here in the UK, of disabled unemployed and saying now you're actually not as disabled as you thought you were or you were previously, you're moving forward. And it's actually resulted in a tripling of belligerence in those disabled unemployed in terms of wanting to get a job, which I'll go on to in a second. And we've looked at the dropout rate. Have you ever worked with or know of working with unemployed customers, and you work with them and they're motivated, they apply for jobs, they get an interview, you phone them up just before the interview, good luck, I know you're going to be great at this, you speak to the employer afterwards, they didn't turn up. Or if they did turn up and get the job, they drop out in 3 weeks to 3 months. Now, what's going on? Why does that happen? So we've been investigating all of that. Now, look, the key thing, the first part, that assessment of our three-part model, was inspired really by what we saw as a challenge by the Director of Work Services at the DWP, who said that the holy grail of employment services in most Western nations is to identify in the first 6 months of somebody being unemployed whether they're going to become long-term unemployed. Because as all three of you identified, you know, once you go beyond a certain period of long-term unemployment, that's it, you are long-term unemployed. There's a perfect study, Giad and Dickens in 2012, found that as soon as you go beyond that point of 6 months unemployment, your likelihood of getting an interview drops by 81%. So it's a remarkable impact. So we saw that as a challenge. I said, great, I'll go off. I'm starting my PhD. I'll come back next year to London and I would have solved this. How long have you been working on it? 15 years, they said. Oh, no. So I went away. 11 months later, I'd got nowhere. I'd wasted 11 months of my life. In desperation, I wrote to a number of universities, UPenn, Stanford, University of Sydney, etc. One came back that I'd never really heard of, the University of Rhode Island. And they said, we've got something that we think might work here in being able to identify job seekers, whether they're going to be in work in 6 months' time or not, on their own steam. And we've been doing it with smokers since 1982, 250,000 smokers. And what we're able to do, and some of you might have heard of what they call, and it was Dr. Prochaska wrote to me and said, we've got the trans-theoretical model of change by Prochaska and Di Clemente, but we call it stage of change. A lot of you might be familiar with this. And what they do simply, and their hypothesis is wonderfully simple, it's common sense. If you time your interventions with somebody, according to their genuine commitment to change, you can up to double intervention success. So with smokers, for example, if they're a pre-contemplator, they have no intention at all of giving up smoking. Now, if you've got an expensive and precious 30 minutes intervention time with somebody, and you talk to them about e-cigarettes, nicotine patches, maybe group sessions, if they're a pre-contemplator, that's an absolute waste of time. In fact, it's alienating to them. They don't care about that. You need to talk to them about the pros of giving up smoking outweighing the cons. But similarly, if they're in the action stage of change, if you talk to an action person about lung cancer, passive smoking, a bad example set for children, that's also a complete and utter waste of time and money. They want to know about nicotine patches, e-cigarettes. Now, hopefully, when we put this, and it was originally 100 questions and it was paper-based, then over the last 30 years, they've got it down to 12 questions, 12 items to ascertain somebody's stage of change without losing validity. It was still paper-based and it took 24 minutes to score for employment advisors. Now, you impose that upon, they don't want to know. So we put it online. There was also a bias. 34% of the time, the advisor would score this wrongly based on their prejudices or bias of what that person sitting in front of them, what their genuine commitment to job searching was. So hopefully, when we've done a telephone survey of employment service interventions, many of which would be inspired by the work you've done, 70% of interventions are action-based. You know, you want to get a job and here's how you do it. You want to do job search, you want to do it online, etc. So hopefully 70% of our job seekers are in the action or maybe the preparation stage of change. Yes, I want a job, I'm just lacking a bit of confidence and support. So these are the results we uncovered. We found that only 32% of caseload. Now this was with our first 21,000 participants. In fact, it was consistent from the first 100. These figures have barely changed. Only a third of job seekers are genuinely committed to finding work. The preparers are good as well. The preparation 20% are nice. They genuinely want a job. They want you to help them get a job. Maybe they want a vocational course. That will help them. So just over 50% of caseload are genuinely committed to finding work. 19% are what we call unauthentic actors, new to science, this category, but we all know they exist. These are people that are taking all of the actions of getting a job, maybe getting an interview or even getting a job, but they've got absolutely no belief or desire to get a job. These are the people that drop out of interviews or drop out of work very quickly. They infuriate employers. But we all know that they exist there. Contemplators are people that have no intention of getting a job for at least the next 6 months, maybe as a New Year's resolution. And pre-contemplators, no, I don't want a job and I don't care who knows it. So this is fascinating. We found the figures here in Australia are very similar to California. Maybe this personality or these figures are where it's sunny, so we're just starting to get the data from the UK. What we found fascinating as well is that there is a correlation, not necessarily a causation, with the famous learned helplessness experiments, where all species, in the face of repeated adversity over which they seem to have no control, give up trying, even when they can escape, even when an opportunity to present itself is there. So this means that dull bludgers aren't evil human beings. They're acting in exactly the same manner as the entire animal kingdom. They've been knocked back. They're embarrassed to be seen trying. It's just awkward for them. So they conserve energy. They curl up and they don't want to be seen to be trying because it's embarrassing, largely. Oh, and this is, we tracked for a year, 8,000 versus 20,000 control group, but we can see that the stage of change that people are in is a precise predictor of their likelihood of being in work. And we did it over 6 months. It was more pronounced than this, but it's the most accurate predictor we can find of whether that person sitting in front of you is genuinely going to be in work in the next 6 months or so. So, what do we do? So once we've found out their genuine stage of change through this Park assessment, we print off this or save this coaching guide for the advisors, which says what this client in front of you, what this job seeker is really thinking, and what you should do with them to stop that half-hour session being alienating and a whinge fest, and turn it into an engaging session that moves the person forward. Much of this good employment advisors are doing intuitively anyway, but this just gives some confidence and guidance. And then we've also devised the resilience workshops. It's perhaps a passé word almost now, it's everywhere, but mental toughness and self-efficacy and building that in those that don't really want a job or are lacking the confidence to get one is absolutely essential. It's the core. It's the behaviour change that we need to implement with this sector. And we've gone, in terms of the strengths, we went to the VIA Institute in Cincinnati. Positivity, we hung out with Barb Fredrickson for a while. Mindset, we spoke and met with Carol Dweck in Stanford. Quite often talking directly to these world-leading scientists and psychologists, you get a very different picture to what you read in their books, and you find out what really is motivating people. So these 5 half-day workshops are for about 2/3 of the caseload, the job-seeking caseload. So anyway, all of this is bluff and bluster, an assessment, a couple of different interventions, coaching guides, and the 5 half-day workshops. So did we get any results with this? No, goodbye. So the results we had, this was with 3 different projects, and every one got exactly the same result, a 19% increase in people getting jobs that have been through this compared to the control groups. So they've been through the assessment and timed interventions. After 9 months, that had increased to 54%. So truly world-leading. Now, of course, we're throwing interventions at these people. 5 half-day workshops containing 31 interventions. Which of those are working? And that's the next stage of our research and studying. But this was the most important data for me. These are the long-term unemployed, what we'd call stream 3s and 4s in Australia, the ones furthest from employment. Their likelihood of still being in work 3 months after getting a new job increased by 105%. It doubled. So these are sustainable outcomes, sustainable impacts. And of course, then we have beautiful people who's going to appreciate being 3 foot tall there, like Jeff Garrett, Queensland's chief scientist, calling the model profound. We got senior, can I call him senior at the Department of Employment, Stuart Watson, calling it, after a couple of cocktails, an unprecedented model. But much of it's logical. You could have guessed and put this together. And finally, employment service providers calling it game-changing. So that's it. If there's any real lesson from this, it's It's just have a bit of confidence in trialing things and experimenting, because whatever you think or have a hunch might work, you will see it's been tried in other environments with smokers or with macaque monkeys, and it amazingly applies to our marketplace. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm Susan Wheeler. I'm from the Department of Human Services in Melbourne, in Australia. And I used to actually work for CRS Australia prior to starting to work in research for in behavioural insights. So I'm just curious how you controlled for consistency of the case manager, because you're focusing on the unemployed, but how did you ensure that you got the one-to-ones to be consistent and your programs to be consistent?
This is the great difficulty we all face with researching in a proper academic manner. Yeah, because we're dealing with commercial organisations often trying to implement this, and so they can't say, right, I want that coach, that employment advisor, to do it in a certain way with one person, and then with the next person, job seeker that walks through the door, to do slightly different interventions, because part of what we do is training up those advisors to use different techniques, proper coaching, positive psychological techniques, whatever it might be, and they can't just shut off with one person. That would be a true control, the same advisor with different people and the same advisor doing perfectly different things. So yes, it's difficult, and that's a really beautiful weakness that I'm so glad you pointed out with this. But it's the only way we can do it. The only key difference is those 5 resilience workshops, which 2/3 of the of participants go through, because they're not 100% they're not in the action stage of change. So yeah, it's very difficult to get a pure control with the same advisor dealing with different personnel, different job seekers differently.
Can I just turn to the other speakers in terms of consistency, and how did you approach that in your research?
Well, in our case, it's easy because it's just the brochure, right? The brochure is what it is, and there's no. Well, I think it doesn't apply in our. It doesn't apply in our context.
Anything you want to comment on?
I think one of the things that makes some of these interventions easy is if you find an environment where you can standardize it, right? That's what I liked about the internet. I'm not saying that the internet is going to do wonders. I do think there's a real role for high-level interventions, spending time with people, having a real person there coaching you, and so on. And I think then one runs into all of these troubles, including having a huge package of things that's kind of hard to dissect. I think the internet allows to get some glimpses of what might be going on, because in principle one can experiment relatively cheaply, and in principle dissect on which dimensions and do it in a very replicable manner. But obviously there's a lot of things that one can't do in terms of the time that one can put into these people.
Great, thanks. Robert Matthews, journalist with BBC Focus magazine. Over the years I've covered lots of research that has identified interventions which have a very positive effect on things like the behaviour of young offenders, in young offenders institutions, where there's a nutritional intervention that brings about better control and things like that. So, and time and again, these things have failed to get traction despite having solid scientific evidence behind them, because the politicians don't like them. Because ultimately they say, well, we need to get across the idea we're tough on young offenders. In your case, it's I'm sorry, this is very nice giving brochures to the long-term unemployed. We need to be seen to be tough on layabouts. So your wonderful, evidence-based research ends up, not getting anywhere. I wonder to what extent politicians may be changing their attitudes, and whether you've encountered that resistance. And secondly, whether you've given any consideration to applying nudge theory to politicians.
Oh, don't we love that idea? Obviously, a number of different countries represented across the panel in terms of who you've been working with. Who would like to comment first? So, just in terms of your work with sickness, is government listening to you?
Well, for this particular research project, it's easy since it's an already implemented policy. So the bureaucrats were very happy to hear the positive evaluation of their already implemented policy. Yeah.
Do you feel listened to by politicians?
So I think the UK is very open. I think the behavioral insights team is one of the indications of that they're very open. And I do think that it might be particularly true for interventions that are actually truly nice. If you actually spend additional money, the things like sending brochures, giving internet advice, I think it's generally accepted as a no-brainer. It's not particularly pampering to people that you think you should be tough on. What I do think is, right, so academia is often criticized for being in an ivory tower. And despite the openness and all the wonderful work that is being done in the UK, it turns out to be not completely easy to get in touch with the right policy units, right? The DWP has no telephone numbers online, right? For the right reasons, I think. They don't want to be called all the time, right? But it turns out that even though the individual people are super nice and very supportive, kind of getting into these, kind of getting to the right people, I think it's at least as hard as getting into the ivory tower of academia, despite what I think is all the right ambition. So I think it's actually all the right things are in place, but the transition has been, let's say, a bit harder than I might have expected from the outstart.
Darren, you've worked in several countries. What's your experience been?
It is fascinating, but the questions really, there's a layer of bureaucrats or people that run departments, and then there's a minister. And the minister's role will change in 2 years' time. There's a merry-go-round. In fact, the minister's objective is to keep his job or be promoted. Marty Seligman, who implemented a lot of behavioural change and resilience or positivity workshops with 23 comprehensives over here, when he presents the results of that, he talks about improved well-being, happiness, behaviours and attitudes, and then may critique Michael Gove, who was Secretary of State at the time, for saying, well, that's all very well and good, but we want literacy and numeracy. That's what I'm measured on, that's what I'm paid for, that's what the electorate votes me in on, because it's particularly in Britain, which is much harsher. What would the papers say in case somebody gets hold of this, which really drives the first action and implementation. Now, of course, literacy and numeracy results did go up, but it was about the 7th thing that was mentioned. So there is a mismatch of academia and politicians, and then a third part of that triangle of people working for departments actually trying to implement this. This is why we're kind of here, is because the behavioural insights or the nudge theory movement is acting as an architect or a communicator between those three. So that's why we've had to change our language to, it's a 10-fold return on investment. It gets these people back into work within 6 months, whereas I'd much rather research over 5 to 10 years, but of course to a politician that's irrelevant because he won't be there in 18 months' time.
So are you benefiting a bit from the fact that we live in a time of austerity, so ministers are very keen on stuff that saves money?
Yes, but it took years for us to realise that. We were still going, these people are so much happier, these unemployed people. Their well-being's up, they're more proactive, and then we should be measuring they've got a lot more jobs and a lot more quickly, and they're staying in the jobs as well. So it's taken us a while, almost bankrupted us after $1 million of investment to actually realise that. And it's down to us, and that's the whole point of behavioural science and the session just before this. It's how do you communicate effectively, and how do you communicate between different sensibilities and departments.
It is just to add, it is all about results. If you can't talk to them about results, you just get nowhere. So, for instance, at the moment, the government is consulting on mandating treatment for people who are addicted or obese. They could lose their benefits. And if we think that's a bad idea, we have to talk about the evidence of the fact. To do that, it's going to be counterproductive. Otherwise it just won't cut through. Florian, do you want to add something to that?
Just very, very quickly. I think that, actually economic science has, the theory of political economy gives great reasons why politicians not necessarily adhere to things that are effective, because their incentive system is very, very complex. On the other hand, for many of the things we have just seen here, it's not necessarily the politicians that need to implement it, but it's really, as you also suggested, it's the administration that has the capacity to do it. And their incentive system often, I think, is different. So it seems that approaching them might in some cases at least be more effective than approaching politicians if you want to do something like a simple brochure or something. To your second question, should we nudge politicians? I think no. But it's interesting because it leads to interesting, I mean, at some point we would need to nudge the people that nudge the politicians, and so it will be a complicated circle.
Thank you. My name is Adrian Brown. I work at something called the Centre for Public Impact. Thanks very much for your talks. I found them very interesting. Two related questions. One is, I got a sense from several of you that you wished you could get access to more government data, because government obviously in this field, government holds a vast amount of data, and when you're doing your own particular studies, you can access a certain amount of it. So I wondered the extent to which you found a willingness for government to open up and to let you access all of the data, or to be much freer access to data. And the second question is related. So that would imply that you could potentially run experiments on a much larger scale and much more continuously on an ongoing basis. And the extent to which there's a reluctance to be seen to be experimenting on people, and maybe the politicians would have something to say about that as well.
So I said that before. I actually find the UK quite open, right? I think some of these things are tricky, right? You work with unemployed job seekers, right? There are certain confidentiality issues that I think should be relatively easily resolved. I think if you're a professor at a university in the UK, you should be relatively easily accredited, and maybe that's the case. But there's a bunch of, right, so I think it's fair to say that countries like Denmark have a much longer tradition to actually reveal basically nearly everything with the right precautions. And I think we still have a ways to go. If we had this type of access, I think we could do more. Right? But for some things you need more than just data. So data would already be great. It would allow me to go back and look at the people in my study and follow them, which would be great. But the second part is, for some of these things, you partially need the cooperation for these interventions, right? It's nice if I do things with 300 job seekers, but if I want to see something with 300,000 job seekers, right, I either get the government on board or not, right? And for that, I think they legitimately have to weigh whether the benefits that I offer are higher than, I mean, there are lots of people that do interesting stuff, and I think part of the roles of the government is to tease out which ones are really cost effective, cheap to implement, and so on. As I said, I find the UK actually very open, but I think people have a lot on their plate. So getting through is a challenge, and I would certainly, right, that's probably the margin that can be most improved.
Yeah, that's a good thing you don't get a chance. It is interesting, and I think in the last 5 years I've seen a sea change in opinions. Once you get to the right person at the DWP or Department of Employment or the Welfare Department or Human Services in the States, and you start saying, oh, we've done this research and we've found this, that there's a wellspring or overflowing of excitement and interest, and you're going, oh my God, you found that, so we found this. And the departments often have a huge amount of research that apparently is publicly available, but people don't look into it. Whether the private or outsourced employment service firms are doing their own thing, but nearly all of the focus and energy goes on compliance and process rather than innovation, except for just before a new tender when they're desperate to prove some sort of innovation and progress. But that's the real impetus of behavioural science, and why it's so interesting to different departments at the moment, is that it reduces the risk in trying new things and interventions. And I think that just the openness, the number of government departments represented at this conference and the number of practitioners and researchers is wonderful, because they're desperate to know facts and not basing new policy or intervention plans on assumptions. But now you can say, oh, we've tried this here, we've tried it overseas, we've seen it there, I'm not going to lose my job over this, which is always the first question they ask themselves, and then they can roll it out. So yeah, it has changed, and hence this conference in its entirety.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Esme Wilcox. I redesign public services and in local government at the moment, and involved in a project where we're trying to support young people with disabilities getting into employment. And a lot of the things you said about working with different government agencies kind of really resonate. But my question is much more about the employers' side of things. I'm really interested in what's come out of your research around how to nudge or encourage employers to work with people who they perhaps would have screened out in the past, whether that's your kind of long-term unemployed or recent care leavers or young people with disabilities that make them perhaps socially less functioning in the work environment.
Okay, and gentleman behind?
Hi there. My name is John Hitchin, and I'm director of Retraining, who's one of Kirsty's members. I've got lots of questions for Darren, but I'm not going to ask them. What I'm going to ask is a very particular question of both Philipp and Florian. Both of you mentioned in terms of the sort of split on your findings of the short-term unemployed and long-term unemployed. And I'm just interested is when you looked at the regression through those, were there any other demographic or any other pieces of information that divided or saw different effect sizes? Because, or was that the only kind of interesting difference between the groups, whether ages or gender or anything at all?
Florian, do you take that one?
Yeah, sure. So in our case, let me explain it a little bit. So how we compute this group of being at risk of becoming long-term unemployed is we take the data from our control treatment and we kind of estimate a model of unemployment duration based on a lot of variables that we have. So our data set in that sense is really nice, that we have a lot of socio-demographic data, educational background, employment history and so on. So we estimate this model, and then we have for each individual we have a nice measure of expected unemployment duration, and that's the thing we look at. Another issue with the kind of data set we have is that you need, of course, to tie your hands when analyzing the data, because if you look at every single thing you could potentially look at, clearly you're going to find a lot of significant effects, and it's not clear how meaningful they are. So you have to tie your hands ex ante to think about what are the subgroups I want to look at, and the key group we were interested in is this group of that is at risk of becoming long-term unemployed. We do a couple of robustness checks there, and what we find, for example, that a factor that is very much, which intuitively makes sense, I think, a factor that is very much associated with the risk of becoming long-term unemployment is, of course, educational background. So if you, for example, focus on this group, we find very similar effects. A similar thing is that this group of long-term unemployed typically comes from the low-wage sector. So if we split our sample in terms of that, we find very similar effects. But in general, we try to focus on this group, actually.
Yeah. Philipp, do you want to take that as well?
Just very quickly. So for us, the issue is pretty similar, probably even more severe. We only have 300 people in our study, right? So you have to think in advance quite carefully how you want to chop your sample, because there's nobody left in a given cell if you chop it too fine, right? In our setting, it was clear that it matters whether people by themselves are broad or narrow, right? It's clear that we help those people that don't come up with new ideas by themselves. So that's one thing that we tried. And it turns out, relative to occupational search, all specifications for OECD countries focus on how long are you allowed to focus on the occupation of previous employment, and when do you have to accept job offers from a broader range, right? So this timing dimension is basically embedded in nearly all OECD countries in the way the requirements are already spelled out. They are not very clear on how to achieve this, right? You have to accept them, but how would you ever get these offers, right? But it was clear that unemployment duration is something that you cannot neglect. So that's why I split it along these samples and just we didn't even bother looking at more stuff because we just chop it too fine. We don't have anything to say about the employers. There are other studies that suggest that employers are incredibly price sensitive when offering jobs, but that's not our work, and so from what we have done, unfortunately, we know nothing about the employer side.
Darren, do you know anything about employers? No. Oh, they're good on it. Actually, the Behavioural Insights team are doing some work specifically on that in the UK. Yeah.
But I'll answer your one on the disabled unemployed, if that's fine, and then you can grab me for that third beer later. From our initial research, which we just started with and talking with DSS in Australia, the issue isn't the employer taking on a disabled unemployed person. Quite often the employer or the manager that gets lumbered with doing it, which is, a carefully selected word because that's often how they see it, are open to it and willing and happy. Humans are generally altruistic and want to do it. The key issue is about 65% will not be there 3 months later of the customers. They drop out. and then the employer thinks, have I got to go through all this again? I had ramps installed, or I had special visual things put in place. I spent a lot of my time reading up on it, and then they just chucked it in after 6 weeks. That's the key issue, and that's not the disabled job seekers issue, and it's not the employer's fault. It's the support group's fault for preparing that person mentally for that job and the obstacles they're going to face. And it is about mental toughness, really. So that's what we've been focusing upon, that, getting the carer to support the movement into work as well. Often the carers may hold somebody back because what are they going to do when the person they're caring for actually goes off to work? So there are all sorts of complicating factors, but generally the employer's good. And I think the DSS in Australia have recognised that, and they're saying, how do we make these jobs sustainable? How do we prepare people better and support them better?
Thanks. Hi, my name is Mariana. I'm a researcher with Civic Systems Lab, but my question is actually motivated by my previous work as a foster care social worker. And I'm wondering, many of you, it appears, have focused on populations that were in work and then for various reasons have fallen out of it. But for populations that have never worked and whose parents haven't worked, or they don't have that kind of culture of working, and Darren, you touched on this, what are strategies and specific challenges with that population?
Okay, gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm Mike from National Numeracy. I used Andreas Schleicher's quote, which I use quite often, good numeracy is the best protection against unemployment, low wages and poor health, this morning. And I think it should therefore be particularly relevant in this space. But one thing that our work with job centres across the UK has found, that it's very often the kind of elephant in the room. It remains unidentified, undiagnosed, whereas literacy issues are so evident. The job seeker can't read the form or can't fill in the form, and therefore literacy is the top of the queue, and it's always and numeracy that gets tagged along. It'd be interesting to get the panel's thoughts on that. Obviously, we've got some thoughts and are keen to work with JCP and DWP about that. The second thing is that I think the reason why Schleicher's quote is true, and the correlation's very close there between good numeracy and successful outcomes, is it's actually a proxy for a lot of the points that you were talking about, Darren, about resilience, growth mindset, Angela Duckworth's concepts around grit. Because in order to become numerate in a society where it's socially acceptable to say, I can't do maths, you have shown some of those underlying characteristics. I'd love to do more research around that too, but that's certainly our theory anyway. And it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, so the generation, we've got some classic stories about how a father will mock a child who's trying to get a job.
Ignore them, they're not having a good time.
Yeah, you bastards. So a father will undermine his child trying to get a job, but he'll support his long-term unemployed mate down the pub who's trying to get a job as well. But this is where Britain's done some great work that I've been learning from since I've been over here from Australia in terms of troubled families, where you've got to identify the matriarch, the patriarch, or the lead within a family group and move them forward. I've got a suspicion that half the success of our resilience workshops is that we could have been teaching them how to crochet better, but it's actually changing their peer group of like-minded people, and it's making it not embarrassing trying to get a job. So there's that positive effect as well. So there's a lot of good work gone on here with those sort of the families, but it's the involvement of all of them, which feels a bit woolly and it's expensive. So that's why it's going to be tough to implement.
Hi, I'm not sure what's the proper distance from the microphone, so just tell me.
You're fine, you're fine.
Oh, that's perfect. All right, so my name's Raphael, and I'm a researcher at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And I have a question about sick leave and how to curb it. So you did really wonderful research about long-term sick leave, but I was wondering about this short and medium term, and if you had any either thoughts or research about how to reduce the number of people who think it's acceptable, for example, to take a day off and go to the beach, or to take a week off to have an extra vacation, for example, and how you think that this could be made less socially acceptable in workplaces.
Hi, I'm Hazel. I work for Remploy UK on a project called Wellbeing Through Work, but my question actually relates to the employment advisors who work in the branch. Just example, I had a colleague recently who had a person, as you described, the person who's active but resistant. So they had received the date for a job interview, and the advisor called them up and said, oh, hey, how's it going? All set up for your interview. You know, you've had your bus fare provided to you so that you can get there. Oh, no, I don't think I'm going to make it. And in the background, the sister's kids. Oh, I'm babysitting today. And I wondered if there's any research into the economic contribution or the reasons behind that resistance. Like, perhaps they're actually doing unpaid labour within the family, or, you know, they may come from that background of long-term unemployment, and whether any of that's come out through the research that any of you have done. I was just curious.
Thank you. Ana Maria Muñoz from the World Bank. So I have a question that I think goes for probably Darren. Sorry, I forgot your other two names. I remember his because he's the only one that doesn't have an organization next there. So sorry, mental bias. But two things. So one is that part of your proposals are almost like a black box intervention. We don't really know what is the effect of the training or the counseling. So what is the effect of the information part or the motivation part in the brochure? And from the policymaking perspective, actually that matters a lot, because I can be far more effective only telling the advisor to use that quick booklet instead of giving people 5 hours of training in 5 weeks. It's very costly, both for the government side, but also for the side of the one that is of the job seeker. So that's one bit. And I think, I mean, you did not report changing things, so saying giving a brochure only on information versus one only on motivation, or combining a couple of things, but not sort of like the big black box, as we cannot then distinguish. So that is one part. The other one was probably for most of you, if you did any kind of baseline measures on psychological or other type of tests, so attitudes, self-perceptions, of self-reported measures on motivation, grit, commitment to task, forward-looking, anything that could give us some more hints besides just, I'm looking for a job and I'm really interested in a job.
Lovely, thank you. Good, diverse questions. Going to come to you first of all in terms of the sick leave one. Ragnhild,
Yeah, so first about, there is some evidence from economic research on sick leave suggesting that there's one trait with the system that is really not a good idea, and that is to have a day, the first day of absence, where the worker has to pay himself or cover the cost, because it turns out that you should think that this might reduce the probability of people not showing up at work, but it turns out that given that you have already been absent one day, you will be afraid to go back to work and then might fall ill again and having to bear the cost of another first day of absence. So this is one characteristic that is quite common in many countries, but which turn out to have some negative effects. And about the norms in the workplace, there is also research on peer effects in sick leave. And they tend to find that there seem to be some peer effects in terms of norms. So a high absence might spread in the workplace through bad norms. So it seems to be scope for reducing absence by talking about norms, but I don't know how exactly.
Lovely. Darren, do you want to take the point about unauthentic actors, and whether there might be legitimate reasons behind that?
In general, or in workers' compensation?
In relation to the particular question, which was about childcare, wasn't it? You know, was an example given.
Oh, your one, yes. Yeah, and it's tough. But what you would have experienced, and many people on the front line would have experienced, is that when somebody doesn't do something, the reasons for it are genuine, the barriers are genuine, and they cascade out. There are numerous. But the core reason is commitment to doing that thing in the first place, and being able to stand up to other family members and say, no, I want to do this. It's accepted. But how do you tell somebody that? Well, you should have stood up for yourself. You know, what's more important to you? Let's consider this in the long run. If you're getting a job, you can afford to pay for their childcare or whatever. You can't have that conversation with people. But the core boils down to somebody's genuine commitment to finding work, and you can't make them want to. And many of them have thought, well, what's the point? You know, I've gone to 10 interviews before and I've not got a job. If you just tell them the fact that, you know, on average in Britain there are 24 interviews per job, then it's just a numbers game. You're going to foul at 23 and you get the 24th one and people will try a lot more. So yeah, it's hard, but once you identify their genuine commitment, then you can start working on the psychological interventions. Problem is, psychologists are very expensive to use to implement all of our job search interventions. So then you've got to kind of break them down and give them to the employment advisors who, in my experience and as a psychologist, are actually more attuned and better psychologists than a lot of the qualified people. So it's not impossible, it's just what's scalable and how quickly.
And then, Florian, just to pick up the point from the World Bank about the baseline measures of psychology, vis-a-vis the intervention.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said already, the one I think great thing about our study is that we have access to this official register data. A disadvantage of that is that once you have access to this data, they will not allow you to merge it with other data sets, which is why we could not go to these people and sort of do additional studies, baseline measures on motivation, all kinds of preferences and so on. So we simply don't have it, and it's not, the data set we have is a big one, but it doesn't contain these kind of measures. Now to your other questions about what's really driving the effect, I think it's an interesting question. I would love to know, but we don't. What I can say is that from a policy perspective, it seems to me that what we know already, to think about, is this a measure sort of that is worth implementing? I think we know already quite a lot, because it seems that we have evaluated it and it seems to work, in particular for specific subgroups. So if you compare that with sort of other policy measures that are at place, I think our measure has been evaluated quite a lot compared to other measures. Again, sort of from a research perspective, I would love to know what's driving the effects of our brochure. Is it motivation? Is it information? Is it just the fact that you are receiving this brochure, that you know that somebody cares about you and wants to know how you're doing and so on? I would love to know. We would simply need to run additional treatments, which it's not clear that we will be able to or allowed to do.
Okay, and same question over to you.
So I think in our case it's slightly different in the sense that I think the intervention is very focused. So you might still want to know even more how exactly it works, but it's about occupations, and it's not about motivation. It might motivate people to give them more hope and new ideas, right? But it was very clear, kind of we test one thing, and I think it's a big one. It's something that active labor market policies has debated for quite a while. I think these things are, especially over the internet, cheap enough that you could potentially dig in on several dimensions and see what the individual and combined effects are from doing this, right? I wanted something that's cognitively easy for people, and that's one thing. I mean, your thing seemed to have worked, so apparently people can juggle many dimensions at once. I wanted something that stays so easy for people that they don't confused about occupations and geography and whatnot. I think it tells for one dimension that it might be promising. We did take measures on all kinds of things, including risk preferences. Do you run out of financial assets? We took personality profiles. We haven't done that much with it yet, because with 300 people, right, it's kind of, it becomes, I think it's the right thing to do, and I'm sure that at some point we'll be asked, and maybe we do it kind of anyhow, but at the moment, the main thing we relied on was the experimental variation, even though I think it gives interesting insights, right? It would just be lovely to have more data.
Okay, now we are out of time, everybody, but I hope you agree that was a fantastic session. Marvellous contributions, and thank you so much for the audience as well, all the participation, really appreciate it. Can we have a round of applause, please?